Okay, good morning. My name is Ben Bingle. I'm the director of the DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership. And thank you for joining us for this webinar on recruiting and engaging board members. We have a few housekeeping items before we begin. First, we're recording today's webinar, and the recording will be sent to you later by email, along with an evaluation form so that you can provide your feedback about today's training. We also have everyone muted, but feel free to use the Q&A and chat features that are built into Zoom, and we'll save some time at the end to address those questions that you submit. You can also drop it in a direct chat to me. I know some people prefer to do it that way, whatever is most convenient for you. We'll have approximately 45 minutes of content for today, and then around 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So with that, let's get started. This is part 2 of a 3-part series on board governance, and I'll share a little bit about our presenter's background. Matt Gayer is the co-executive director of the Catalog for Philanthropy in Washington, D.C., which is the region's only locally focused guide to giving and volunteering. They focus on small nonprofit organizations with a goal to create visibility for these nonprofits, to fuel their growth with philanthropic dollars, and to create a movement for social good in the region. Since 2003, the catalog has raised more than $40 million for their network of vetted nonprofits. Before joining the catalog, Matt worked in a healthcare consulting role at the advisory board company. He's a Truman Scholar, holds a Master of Public Administration degree with a focus on nonprofit management from Syracuse University, and he earned his bachelor's in public policy and political science from Southern Methodist University. Matt, welcome once again. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. And excited to dive into this. Just so folks know, in case you weren't at the first session where we're talking about board structure, all these will kind of live independently. So nothing that you missed last week will impact this week. But that board structure piece, right, was really about thinking about how do we think about organizing our board, right, to drive engagement. Today, we'll really be thinking about how do we get the right people on our board in the first place. So how do we create some structure and some goals to making some decisions about who is going to be on our board. And then equally importantly, when we get some great folks on our board, how do we get them engaged? How do we onboard them successfully? So, when we think about recruitment and onboarding for our boards, and I know, when you think about your board, we talked about this last week, boards exist on a spectrum, right? From a governance board that really is just there for high level issues, to think about management, fiduciary responsibility, all the way over to a working board that's much more focused on, actually being an extension of staff, right? Or extension of our volunteers. And actually doing some of the work itself. So wherever you find yourself on that spectrum, right, from the board basically being a group of folks that do have that oversight, but also are helping get the work done, or on this other side where it really is purely an oversight management, financial management type role, getting the right people is critical, right? And we'll talk about a few of those factors today. Some of the reasons that's so important, though, especially right now with boards being critical during this kind of ever-changing time we find ourselves in, the number one indicator for successful board members, so we'll talk about a lot of skills and networks and all this type of stuff today, but just want to ground us in the fact that the number one indicator of a good board member is that they actually care about what you do, right? At the end of the day, that's the kind of number one thing, right? That they actually have an interest in our mission. They have an interest in the clients that we serve and the community that we serve. And if that's true, then most of the time they're going to be relatively engaged, right? It's when we get away from that, we focus on the other stuff instead of that, that we sometimes get board members who may be less engaged. So that's really critical. We want to highlight that. Secondly, we'll talk about a process for recruitment today, because it's not always just finding the right people. It's finding the right people at the right time. You could have someone who's really passionate about what you do, have amazing skills, but they just don't have time right now, right? Because of work, because of family life, because of a million other things. So we need to find folks that are able to actually commit to the expectations we're setting for them. And then finally, we get a lot of questions from organizations that have been around for a while
that maybe don't have the board engagement they'd like to have right now, trying to shift the culture of their board, right? How to do that. And there's a few tips and tricks that we're always happy to share about how to re-engage, right, or shift that culture. But one of the biggest things you can do, and probably the best thing you can do, is bringing on new people, right? If we have that unengaged board and we start adding 2 or 3 new, really fired up, engaged, energized, passionate board members, the folks that are there either are going to get brought along or realize this may not be a place for them, right? But one of the best ways there to change that culture, if we need to change it, is bringing in new folks to join the team. So with that said, we'll spend the first half of the day diving into board recruitment, how we find folks, how we get them engaged, how we choose who we should find, and getting them right to the point of selection. Then we'll spend the second half of the day talking about onboarding. So once we have these amazing new board members on the team and in the fold, how do we get them engaged right off the bat? It's really critical. We're thinking about both those at the same time. For onboarding, you think about the same as if we hired staff, right? Or when you started a new job yourself. If you're not engaged those first few months, it's really hard to re-engage staff after that, right? So it's really critical we get people engaged from the moment they get there. Because it's really hard for a board member who maybe didn't do that much for the first 9 months to then get fired up afterwards. So we want to make sure we hit the ground running. For board recruitment, just to outline the process, then we'll go through 5 or 6 specific tips within this process to make it as effective as possible. And again, this process may be more or less formal, depending on your board culture, type of organization. But this is a process you can use and kind of run through regardless of if you're kind of a small volunteer organization with a working board or a large organization with a kind of formal governance board. The first step, and we'll talk about this for a bit today, because a lot of times there's a power dynamic with nonprofit boards that we are desperate for board members as nonprofits. And basically, if someone's willing, we say yes, right, and are very excited. We really encourage folks to shift that, right, to shift out of that. I know sometimes that can feel like the reality because it's really tough, right, to find interested, qualified board members in our community sometimes. But knowing what we need, having goals for our recruitment, knowing the skills and networks and connections and identities we're trying to get on the board is really critical, that we're recruiting strategically and not just recruiting kind of widely. And that's going to help us to actually find more people, and we'll talk about how that works. But knowing what our need is, setting some goals there first. Secondly, actually doing the reaching out, right? So we'll talk about some ways to do this, but doing some community outreach and engagement to find those folks that are going to fit our recruitment goals. Third, some type of evaluative or interview process. So again, this is going to differ depending on organization, culture, needs, board history, etc. But there is a real need to do at least some of this, right? So we don't want someone to say, I want to be on our board, and I'll say, great, we'll vote tomorrow on it, right? We want it to be a process. If for no other reason, then this is actually a really good time to check their engagement level before they even join, and we'll talk about how to do that. There's a selection, voting, a celebration, right? They get on the board itself, and then obviously the second half of the day, there's the onboarding piece, right? Where we want to make sure that we get them fully engaged to the board right off the bat. So when we're thinking about recruitment, again, a great place to start, really a necessary place to start, is setting some goals for what we want in the first place, right? So, sometimes we might be recruiting because we literally are out of board members and we need more people in the room. But most of the time, we're above that minimum number, right, of 4 or 5 or 6 or wherever we set for the organization in our bylaws. And we're recruiting to make the board stronger. And if we're doing that to hopefully fill some gaps, maybe address some areas of weakness, maybe diversify the board. We'll talk about some of those goals we could set today. So one of the goals could be around skills, experience, or connections. We'll talk about a tool here in just a second for how to do this well. But setting a goal for the number of new members we need with specific skills, right? So maybe it's marketing, maybe it's fundraising, finance, strategy.
It could also be experience. I'll talk about more about this in a second, but it's not always just hard skills, right? Sometimes we do need someone with a finance background who is an accountant who can read financial statements and help our organization do so. But sometimes it might be the fact that we're launching a lot of new programs. So we want someone with kind of a entrepreneurial mindset or experience, right? Maybe someone who started a business before, because they're going to have that kind of experience that's analogous to what we're doing there. So having someone with that experience on the board could be helpful. And then the other kind of category we're often thinking about here is connections, right? So networks. Again, this doesn't mean we're going out there looking for board members who are millionaires and can invite us to all their millionaire friends. Sometimes we are, usually we're not. But thinking about instead, what networks are they tap into? They went to a local college. There's an alumni association, right, that they can connect us to. They work in the Chamber of Commerce, right? They're going to be able to connect us to a lot of businesses. They work at a large local company. They're going to have a lot of coworkers. But thinking about what networks they're going to be able to tap into that maybe we can't currently with the folks in our group. So we're going to set some goals around that. We'll talk more about that in a second. We should set some goals for the number of people that are going to apply or kind of state that they're interested in the board and the number accepted, and knowing that those numbers don't have to be the same. It is probably a new experience for some to maybe turn away someone who's interested in board service. But if we're doing our recruitment really well, that almost inevitably is going to happen, right? That we're talking to folks, we find more interested folks than we have spots. So we'll talk about what to do when we have to do that, how to keep those folks engaged. That ultimately is a good sign that recruitment is kind of healthy and strong there. And then finally, obviously, increasingly, nonprofits and boards are thinking about setting goals around diversifying their board, making it a more equitable and inclusive space. We know that typically speaking, only 16% in a study of our own local nonprofits in the DC area have a board that is a majority BIPOC board, so people of color board. So this is continuing to be a goal for a lot of boards, whether it be around gender or age, race, location. So this is something we know also people are setting goals on there and can use the tools we'll talk about today to do so. So the second tip, and this is kind of the tool we were mentioning that highlights these goals around recruitment, is thinking about a board matrix, right? Which is a real fancy way of basically saying, like, who do we have on our board that can do what, right? So this is just going to keep track of a few different categories for us. You can make this as simple as you want or as complicated. We have somewhere in the middle on the template that we have. We're going to send out the slides afterwards, but also a copy of this tool. So you will have this editable tool that you can use to kind of get started if you haven't done this before. But basically, horizontally here on the tool is just a roster of your board members. If you want to keep this anonymous, you could just number the board members and have the board chair or executive director do this outreach. If board members don't care to be anonymous, you can actually put their names on here. And then going down, you'll see a few different categories, right? So we think about connections. So again, what networks are you going to be able to tap into? We can be more specific than this, or we can keep it really high level for types of network. What their employment is currently, right? Are they working in a field that's related to our programming? Is it something that kind of matters to the organization? And then really the three biggest things, two of which you can sort of see on the screenshot of the tool, are skills, expertise, and then the final category down at the bottom is around demographics. So those are the three we see people use most often. The connections can be helpful sometimes, but really skills, expertise, demographics. Demographics, if we're thinking about trying to diversify the board, if we have some specific goals there. So knowing where our board members are right now will help us know where our gaps are in terms of identities. And then skills and expertise, again, get to some of those hard skills like accounting, right? Or like you're a lawyer, you can bring those type of skills to play when you're a board member, or expertise that again might be some kind of broad topic areas or might be things you've done, right? Start a business, lead a large team, etc. So having these in place and having board members kind of self-fill this out let you know, like, hey, actually, even though I'm an accountant, I actually also used to do marketing, right? Or I actually started a business before. So sometimes you'll find things out about your board members you don't know. But working with them to fill this out, see where your gaps are, and think about, okay, great, like we're obviously very strong in legal and accounting, but we don't have anyone that does marketing or fundraising. We should try to find someone to fill that gap, right? So this can help us begin to form our priorities. This tool should work in kind of tandem with what we have on our plate, right? So if we just set a new strategic plan, right, if we have some big goals for the organization, where we're going should drive who we get on our board a little bit. And then these gaps should drive it. So those two things together helps us set our recruitment goals and helps us set our job description, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is the other tool that we'll share. So we'll send this out as well with the board matrix and the slides afterwards. And we talked about this briefly last week, but we'll dive deeper into it right now. But it's really encouraging all that as you're doing your recruitment, having a board job description that people can look at before they apply. So this is basically usually kind of a one-pager, sometimes a simple two, modeled after a regular job description you would use for any kind of staff role, obviously without some of the things like compensation and benefits and everything. But really just describes a little bit about who you are, you know, your mission, vision, focus right now, etc. Sometimes it talks a little bit about board history, if you want to include that in there. But really focuses the majority of the document on the expectations for a board member. Again, there's a lot of misconceptions about what being a board member means. Either, you know, sometimes we see people wanting to join a board and be too in the weeds if it's more of a governance board. But the biggest thing is actually we often see folks self-identify as not being qualified and often would be, right? For a lot of smaller organizations, you know, that mid-career professional who's in their 30s, who's a marketer, might have perfect marketing experience and much more so than the staff and could actually be really helpful for the organization, but they may not see themselves as a board member material yet, right? Too young or not senior enough in the career, can't donate 10K. So helping reset those expectations a bit so people can see themselves in the role is a really important part of both diversifying our board, but then also getting folks the real tangible skills we need. And if we're a working board, those younger kind of board members sometimes that might have a bit more time actually might be exactly who we're looking for. So we want to make sure that they see themselves in this role and kind of reflected in it. The other thing we're using this for is that, you know, we mentioned this last time again, and I'll mention it probably in every board workshop I ever do, is that the number one reason for any type of issues or struggles between board and staff is typically misaligned expectations. So board members think they signed up to do one thing. Staff are hoping board members will do something else. They never kind of directly state it or put it out there. And then both are disappointed by the experience. So it's really important from the get-go when we're recruiting people before they even join, that we're beginning to set an ideal of what you're going to have to do as a board member, right? Here's what the role includes. So really focusing on like the time commitment here, which may be a lot or a little, but being honest about that and transparent. The frequency of meetings, where those occur, you know, anything else that like we really want to make sure, you know, the financial commitment, their role in fundraising, you know, an expectation they'll step up to leadership roles eventually, all the type of stuff being able to put in here to help folks understand that if I join, here's what's going to be expected of me, so they can go in kind of transparently understanding what they're going to need to do. So using this whenever we're recruiting is something we really recommend. So for doing the recruiting itself, right? So now we have our goals, we use our matrix, we know who we want to get, right? We want some people with marketing or fundraising experience or legal or accounting. And we have a job description for them. How do we actually go out and do the outreach, right? One of the things I will say here is using that job description. So just because we make it now means we actually have to use it. So when we're doing outreach, like we'll talk about here in a second, making sure we're setting that job description along. One of the things we see work really well for organizations, especially if trying to diversify their boards and diversify in a number of different ways, is using existing networks. So a lot of times kind of traditional board recruitment, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, but traditional board recruitment is that we tell the board we're looking for someone to join, right? And sometimes, hopefully, we're setting goals. So we say a little bit more, right? We're looking for an accountant, looking for a lawyer, we're looking for X, Y, or Z. And then the board sits there for a second and then kind of offers up names, right? Like, I have a friend, I have a colleague, I used to work with somebody, etc. Right? They do some personal outreach, and then that person gets put into the process. Totally fine. That is the bread and butter for board recruitment, right? Is kind of personal recommendation there. There are some benefits to that. When those people join, they already know someone on the board, so it's a little bit of a tighter knit group. But the downsides of that traditional board recruitment is that we're usually tapping into the same networks then, kind of again and again, right? Because if I already know them, we probably have some overlap of social connections. So when we think about trying to get more people interested and aware of our organization, that sometimes gets difficult if they all have kind of similar types of contacts. So one thing we can do to get past that is using existing networks that are out there. So you can think about alumni networks, you can think about business associations, civic associations, right? Rotary Club, things like this that already exist in the community, hopefully, that we can send that job description to, work with, and try to get them to send it out to their folks on our behalf. We'll talk about how to prioritize those networks here in just a second. But thinking about that as one way to kind of get the message out there and maybe get some folks who don't know us already. Another tip here for posting online, you're definitely going to get a wide range of responses sometimes. Not all of them are going to be folks you want to put into the process even. You might just say no outright. But posting to job boards or community boards online can be helpful. Sometimes you never know who follows you on social media. That might be a great local board member that you haven't met. Posting this as a volunteer opportunity on LinkedIn, posting it as a volunteer board opportunity on Idealist. All those can be really helpful, and most free. Idealist has some cost to it, but the rest of those free. Things you can do to try to get, again, outside of our own networks and maybe bring in some new people to the organization that aren't connected to us currently. When posting those, we want to include that job description and also include who we're looking for, right? So not just saying, hey, are you reading this and interested? But here's the skill sets we're looking for. Here's some of the identities we're looking for. Here's some of the expertise we're looking for. So hopefully people are self-selecting in or out appropriately there. And then finally, for peer organizations, we're not looking at other local nonprofits to kind of poach their board members, right, necessarily. But we are looking to see if there's any trends there, right? If I look around at other, local environmental nonprofits that are a similar size to me, and all of them have board members from this, local law firm, right, or local business or local, et cetera. It might be an indicator to me that like someone over there is telling folks to join these boards, and a company I should maybe talk to, right, or a group I should talk to, or just some new ideas for types of board members to have. So that can be helpful for just getting a little bit of a sense of who's on other local boards. Are there some common denominators there? And should I be tapping into a resource or a network that I haven't thought of yet? Our fifth tip here, and this is for specifically right now when some of our outreach to board members might still be digital. This doesn't shift much if it's in person again in the future, but we want to make sure we're being timely right now. So a few things here for outreach while it is still virtual, and we'll talk about how this shifts if it's in person. We still want this to be kind of, that traditional board outreach is still effective. So as much as we're saying use these existing networks, use these external networks, post online, which we should be doing to diversify who's kind of coming to the board, there's no reason to stop necessarily also making personal references. And right now, as things are kind of digital, as it's harder to maybe build new relationships with people, if we really need people to join quickly, the personal outreach, right, of who do you know that might fit this description of a board member is probably going to be our most successful option. So in the short term, maybe leaning a little bit more heavy on that traditional model. Long term, really trying to balance those two would be our advice there. Secondly, the network outreach is still a possibility. A lot of external networks that exist, right? So you can think about alumni networks, you can think about civic associations. A lot of the things they probably used to tell their members they could do, right, or offer as an opportunity, volunteer opportunities, etc. They can't do right now, right? Because they can't gather groups or get a lot of people together necessarily. So a lot of those networks are actually more likely than usual to share your volunteer opportunities, to share your board opportunities right now, because they're looking to add value and share something with their membership. So that can be a good option. And then finally, if we do end up having a lot of folks interested, right? So let's say we post online and we get 10 or 12 responses back, right? Or we have several folks that are in our pipeline that we're thinking about might be good for board service. We don't always have to do all this on a one-on-one basis. We could invite that group of board prospects together virtually or eventually in person to do kind of a ask us anything session, right? Hey, we know you're interested in the board or supporting the organization in some way. Wanted to be here to answer any questions. Here's a couple of things we have coming up on the horizon we want you to know about, but feel free to let us know what you want to talk about, right? And answer some questions in bulk. That can be a great way to kind of move a group forward and get some people who might be more or less engaged during that process. Often we see this more for like a junior board or similar opportunity, but you could use it for a senior board as well. And then finally, again, we wanted to talk about kind of what selection process looks like right now, knowing that things are virtual. And again, this process doesn't shift much in person, so we'll talk about that difference here in just a second. But we want people to apply. So first step, kind of virtual or in person, we want people to submit an application. Typically the resume, so the board can see a little bit of their professional experience, and then just a statement or note of interest, right? This is just like a paragraph, a few lines. We're big believers the world does not need more cover letters. So not necessarily doing a full kind of one-page cover letter or anything, just a paragraph about like, hey, why do you care about this, right? Why are you interested in being on this board? Can be a great way to kind of get them engaged right off the bat. Secondly, where this kind of review typically lives is typically the governance committee on our board is going to review these applications. If we don't have a governance committee, if our governance committee is not very engaged, the executive committee is usually the backup option there, right? The chair, vice chair, secretary, and treasurer are going to review the materials from the interested board prospect, preferably a few candidates at the same time so they can do a little bit of comparative analysis there. But either way, they're going to look at those materials. If it looks like a good fit, they're going to schedule an interview. In the future, that'll be over coffee. Right now, it may or may not be over Zoom. But typically speaking, we want 2 board members to meet with them. So every candidate during this process should meet with the executive director at some point if they don't already know them, and should meet with 1 or 2 board members, preferably 2, if they don't already know someone on the board. So scheduling an interview, and we're using an interview not necessarily to really overly grill them on anything, but really it's to share more about the board, share more about the experience, right? The expectations, making sure they're really interested in it, asking a little bit about how their skills and expertise align with some of our gaps right now or our goals that we set out. So we're asking a little bit on that, but really it's a time to share, connect, see if they seem like a good fit. Those board members and the executive director are going to come back with the governance committee or the executive committee to discuss that candidate, right? Discuss the interview, the materials they submitted, and ultimately to make a recommendation. So from this committee, the committee should formally recommend this board member be approved, right, for a vote or move to a vote. Moves to a full board vote, right, where the full board reviews the application materials, knows that the committee is approving of the candidate, and then the full board votes, and if the full board votes yes, that candidate's selected, right, and then the onboard process begins. So really this process stays the same, regardless if it's virtual or in person. The biggest thing that shifts is obviously the way we do that interview. Typically, we try to do just 1 interview to save people some time. We do know some folks that are really focused on getting engaged prospects will actually lengthen this process a bit and do 1 interview with a board member, 1 interview with the ED, 1 interview with another board member. Obviously, the more hurdles we put in place, the more likely is someone drops out. but also the more hurdles we put in place, the more likely is that if someone goes through all of them, they're pretty serious about being on the board. So finding a balance of that, we typically, again, find the resume, letter of interest, and kind of 2 conversations, one with the ED, one with the board, is usually enough to indicate that they're kind of serious about it. But if that is something you're concerned about, or if you're on a working board and maybe want to make sure people signing up are really going to do the work you're going to assign them, adding some interviews, right, and steps in the process can be helpful there. So with that, we're going to shift from board recruitment, right, outreach, selection, now they're on the board, to what we do with them once they join, right, and how we kind of go through board onboarding to make sure they're engaged from the get-go and kind of can hit the ground running there. So the first thing, and again, just to highlight that we know right now that for the majority of our partners we're working with often, they're still having virtual board meetings. Some have begun to come back, some came back and now are virtual again. So we just know people are at a wide range of kind of how they're handling that right now. So if you do find yourself doing virtual onboarding, again, this process looks the same if it's in person or virtual. We just have to think through it a bit more if it's virtual, because we're not going to necessarily be together to do some of these things. The first is that either way, we want to make sure that there's some type of celebration when they first join, right? So I really want the tone and the feeling for a new board member to be one that's kind of celebratory, but also this is like an honor to be on the board, right? So I don't want them just to feel like, hey, great, I have a new thing to list on my resume. I want them to really feel like they're part of a team, part of a culture, that they're excited to kind of roll up their sleeves and do some work. So typically the celebration, we'll talk about some tips for this in a second, but we want to make sure that the whole board knows that they're on now, and that the whole board is able to tell them congrats, welcome, excited to meet you, etc. With that, we want to make an email introduction for them to the full board, so again the full board can share their congratulations. We want to make an email introduction to the chair, right, to make sure that they're connected to the board chair, and that the board chair is talking to them a little bit, to the executive director if they don't know the executive director ahead of time, and one other board member that we'll talk about here in a second. I want to give them a board handbook with a variety of kind of introductory documents. We'll talk about what goes into that here in a few minutes. A board buddy, which we'll also talk about more in a few minutes here, but this is that other board member, and this is like a peer board member that can help them get acclimated to the new experience. So we'll talk about that here in a minute. Put them on a committee to start doing some work, and we'll talk about how to get them on board into a committee. And then finally, and this kind of goes throughout any of the tips we share today on onboarding, just making sure communication stays pretty frequent. We want to make sure that they feel supported, they feel like part of the team, part of the group, and that they didn't join and then just kind of don't hear from us for a while, right? Depending on when they join and how frequently our meetings are, if we have quarterly board meetings, they might join and then not actually be at a board meeting in person or virtual for over 2 months. So it's important to make sure that if we are bringing them on, we're communicating with them regardless of kind of meeting frequency or meeting cycle. So for the initial welcome, right, so thinking about how we phrase and kind of structure those initial communications, again, we want a tone of celebration. We want them to really feel like this is an honor, they get selected, we're excited by it, the board's excited by it. So having board members reach out about that. So including them on kind of, just an all board email, and then really encouraging board members to kind of reach out, ask questions, get connected, all that type of stuff. So make them feel more like part of the team from the beginning there. If we are in person, introducing them at the first board meeting, making sure we give a little bit of an intro for them, then hopefully a little bit of social time before or after so they can connect with board members. We want to make sure that even if it is virtual and we've made this email introduction at the next meeting that they attend, their first meeting, we still do an intro for them. Again, we just want to make sure we're kind of welcoming them into the space. And then we want to build some type of, again, social component at one of their first meetings so they can hopefully get to know some fellow board members a little bit more informally. Again, especially if we're virtual right now, we can only replicate this so much. But maybe we do breakout rooms at our next board meeting. We might just stay on for a few minutes before or after, right, to check in with each other about how they're doing. We want to make sure there's some type of social connection that they're forming one of their first meetings. So a couple of tips here. Again, we want to be celebratory. We want to make sure multiple board members are welcoming them to the space so they feel kind of included as part of the group. We want to make sure we're doing this kind of multiple times, right? That we're introducing them, connecting them in several ways. So the third tip, and this is one that's really critical and can be really, really helpful. And I know realistically, some groups may not be able to do this if they don't have enough engaged board members currently. So if you don't feel like you can do this right now, the ED could be the buddy we talk about here. The executive director could be the buddy. Ideally, it's a fellow board member. But if we need to do that as kind of a stopgap until we get to having engaged board members be buddies, that can be one option. So when we think about a board buddy program, what we're talking about here, right, is choosing kind of a board mentor / buddy, someone that isn't the board chair and isn't the executive director, that's going to help that new board member acclimate and engage in the process. So that board mentor or buddy usually has been on the board for at least 6 months or a year, is pretty engaged themselves right now. We're going to try to really encourage them and let them know that being that buddy or mentor role doesn't mean you need to have answers to every question, right? If the new board member is asking some really detailed financial questions, you don't have to be the one that answers them. You're helping point them in the right direction, right? Oh, you know what? That's a great question for our treasurer. Why don't I introduce you? They're great. I've known them and worked with them for a couple of years, right? It's making it a little easier for them to ask the questions they want to. If there are some easy questions, the board mentor or buddy is kind of surfacing those. And then also, hopefully, this role is helping kind of check in and see how this person's feeling, right, about their board service, with any concerns being elevated to the chair or executive director. So again, this board member, this buddy is there to facilitate, not necessarily know everything. They're checking in early on, before the first meeting, after the first meeting, and then kind of monthly for the first few months. Typically, a board buddy is going to kind of work with a new board member from kind of the moment they're on for usually about the first like 4 to 6 months, right? Depending on kind of what feels necessary there. And again, not a lot of work, especially about like month 3. This is probably just monthly, coffee in the future, right? Or Zoom, or just a quick email, depending on the relationship there. But just wanting this board member to know someone on the board besides the formal leadership cares about their engagement, is what we see be really effective here. The fourth tip for onboarding is around that board handbook we mentioned. So probably if I asked you if you had a board handbook, we see about 50% to kind of 2/3 do have one. But then if I asked you like last time it was updated, right, or it might be digital, but if it was physical, it probably had dust on it, right? This is often something we made at one point, but don't currently have a very robust version of. But we find this really helpful for new board members. So again, the board buddy or mentor helps them kind of get socially connected to the board and has kind of a sounding board for them to ask questions of. The handbook allows folks to kind of get engaged with the board on their own time, right? That they can kind of engage as they want to with it. Some of the things we put in this handbook, because we obviously don't want to give them everything we have. When we're thinking about past documents, historical information to share, it'd be great to have kind of a one-page organizational history, right? This could be a visual timeline, or it could be a written narrative. But either way, just a one-page simple, hey, look, we started in 1986. Here's kind of the big things that happened since, right? Or we started last month. Here's the big things that have happened since. Either way, helping them understand a little bit of the journey of the organization, so they can come in with a little bit of that background. That'll be helpful. The current or last strategic plan, right? Preferably, we have both the last strategic plan and the current one, so they can see how well we did on our last set of goals, and then how well we're doing on our current. And then kind of the big high-level financial documents from just the past 2 years, right? So just like our 990, or if we think our budget versus actual, or our balance sheet, whatever we think is most helpful for getting a sense of, hey, we'll talk plenty about how we're doing right now financially. Last year, though, we did pretty good. 2 years ago, we did okay. Here's the documents going to help you kind of see that. Then finally, any other important milestone documents. Again, we don't want to share, everything in the kitchen sink. That's where board members would get the 60-page PDF and then never read it, right? So I'd be pretty judicious on what we're including here, but including any other big documents we think are going to be helpful. If the board itself has gone through a lot of changes, we might have a board history document here or something, but trying to keep this pretty short and sweet. The biggest bucket, not surprisingly, is the current materials. If we hear, from new board members, sometimes one of the biggest concerns is that it's hard to get up to speed because things are always changing, especially right now. So how we kind of get people feeling comfortable that, yes, you do know what's going on, and shorting that time of confusion and uncertainty. So the minutes from the last 2 board meetings, so they have a sense of what's been talked about recently in board meetings that the board has had. Financials from the past 2 months. So they both will see current financials at their next board meeting, but then they have at least 2 months worth of kind of comparative familiarity with how we're doing right now financially. The current budget versus actual for year to date. So they know how we're performing right now financially compared to our goals. With that, the current budget, so they know what we're working against this year. The current strategic plan or annual goals that were set, so they know kind of what direction is the organization going right now. An org chart, so they have a simple understanding of staff. A 1-page program summary. I know, again, we could include this huge document about everything we do, but try to boil that down to just a 1-page quick summary of like, hey, here's the big buckets of activities our organization does. And then a board roster. So this typically has board members, their kind of professional affiliation, then at least their email, if not their email and phone, so people feel like they can get connected and connect with others if they have questions. Again, the goal here is that this is digestible, can easily and quickly become a lot of material, and again, something we have but don't really use. So it's important that we let new board members know what to prioritize, right? Like maybe read the current stuff first, and then if you have time, go back and read the historical, or maybe read, here's these 4 documents out of all this that we think is really critical to getting plugged in. You could ask current board members on your board, hey, when you joined, what were you most confused by, right? And allow that to guide you about which of these documents to highlight. But we want them to look it over, but reinforce them. They don't have to be an expert on it, right? They're not going to get quizzed on this at the first board meeting. There's no open book test. This is just for them to kind of get comfortable and get plugged in. And this is a great thing for a board buddy to then go back to them, or the ED or chair if needed, to go back to them and say, hey, do you have any questions about this, right? So again, they can engage on their own, and we can ask some questions for follow-up there. One of the other things we recommend is really quickly getting new board members engaged on a committee. So there are times we hear folks do the opposite of this, right? They don't want to overwhelm their new board members, so they give them, 6 months, 9 months where they get on a committee. We actually see that drives kind of that disengagement somewhat, because if they're not doing something right away, right? We have this big celebration that they joined, they don't really do any work for 6 or 9 months. That causes them to just not think of it top of mind necessarily. So instead, getting them plugged in pretty early, not overwhelming, but getting them plugged in early, giving them something to do, can actually keep that engagement level and that excitement level elevated there. So making sure that they see committee charters, right? Understand the roles and responsibilities of those committees so they know what they're signing up for. If they sign up for a committee is a really important thing. We don't want them signing up for a development committee and having no idea what they're going to be doing on the fundraising committee. So it's important to make sure they have a clear understanding of that. After they kind of attend their first board meeting is when we like them to choose a committee. So they attend a meeting, they talk to folks to get a little sense of how we do work, then they pick where they want to kind of plug into. This is going to give them hopefully some type of meaningful task, right? So we want to give them something to do. So get them on a committee and actually get them involved in doing some type of project. This is going to be a good chance to build relationships with a small group. Again, if you come in even to a 10-person board, that can be really intimidating. 9 new people you may or may not know, depending on if you knew anyone ahead of time. So this smaller 3 to 5 people group can be a really good relational experience for them to get connected. We want committees to own parts of the agenda. At the next webinar that we all have next week, we'll talk about board meetings specifically and how to use those to really drive engagement. One of those things is committees reporting out on their work. And even though this new board member probably is not going to be the one reporting, they're going to see their work reflected and communicate at the meeting, and that's going to make them feel more engaged. And then finally, we want to make sure their board buddy, or if not the chair, and if not the chair, the ED, someone is checking on them after the first or second kind of committee meeting, getting a sense for how that's going and how they're kind of feeling about that. And then finally, we just want to give an overview of what that first year for a board member ideally looks like. So right away, right, we're doing that celebratory introductions. We're getting them connected to people. For the first couple of months, they have those board buddy check-ins. They're going to their first board meeting. They're going to their first committee meeting. So they're doing some stuff, but they're also having a lot of conversations with people still. 3 to 6 months, we want to get them plugged into that meaningful work, right? So they have a role in the committee and they're actually doing something and they're getting plugged in there. 6 to 12 months, right? So the second half of the year there, we're probably phasing out that board buddy program, formal board buddy program, but continuing to check in with the chair ED 1 or 2 times, right? So maybe balancing who they're talking to and making sure at least every quarter they're talking to someone. And then the end of that first year, getting them to kind of reflect on that first year, let us know what went well, what didn't, what they would have preferred in the onboarding process so we can continue to improve it. And then their interest in future leadership roles, right? As we're transitioning them from a new board member to a seasoned board member, who now we're trying to get engaged with thinking ahead of time about committee chair positions and exec roles eventually. So with that, I'll just cover a couple quick next steps, and then we'll pause here for questions. So some of those things you can do to kind of get the ball rolling on some of this. Setting some goals again for the types of candidates you want. So you have some goals to drive your recruitment. Planning your interview questions, right, or your virtual selection process, so you have that evaluative part of bringing new people onto the board. Thinking about some external groups to reach out to, so it's not just your own direct contacts. If you are going to have an opening, right, I know 2 of my board members are rolling off, or I know someone said they're going to quit at the end of the year, or et cetera. We should start recruiting about 3 to 4 months before then, because it does take some time, right? Just scheduling takes some time. So it's important we kind of start early there. We want to make sure we're thinking carefully through the onboarding process to get people engaged, especially during that first year, and building a bench, right? People may not be able to join right now, but the more we reach out to them, the more we talk to them about this, the more people we're going to have that are at least aware and possibly interested that we can bring on when the time is right. So with that, I'll stop here to take any questions that we have.
Thank you, Matt. We have had a couple of questions come in. The first one says, we want to do a better job of including clients and former clients on our board as leaders, but we found that they are often reluctant due to schedules or time constraints. Can you offer any suggestions?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So one, many organizations probably heard about this as a trend, right? For a few reasons to start including more directly impacted community members or current or former clients on your board. And that's a great thing to do, but we also do want to note that for some organizations, it's just not realistic for who they serve. So there are other ways to kind of get them connected. If you are looking to do that for your board, one of 2 things. We see some organizations create a separate kind of client board or community board that meets separately, gets together, kind of talks, and then they have usually a representative that reports out to the full kind of governance board. So that's one thing folks have done if they felt like it would be too hard to get that group together as frequently as the board or to have the same commitments as the board. If you are going to actually put someone on your formal board, some of the things we've seen work well for folks is having an individual commitment form. We talked about this last year. You can customize those to the person. So setting some expectations for that individual that may or may not be exactly the same as every other board member that's on there. And then making sure that for the onboarding process, you're really thinking critically. Where we see this go wrong is we bring on someone who maybe doesn't have the same type of professional background as everyone else on the board, and we just kind of onboard them in the same way, and then they don't feel very empowered to actually have a voice on that board. So we do want to make sure if we are bringing on someone to our formal board, we're thinking really carefully about the onboarding process to make sure they're as engaged as possible.
This next question is something that you'll probably look at a little bit more closely next week when we're talking about running better board meetings. But I'm going to put it out there anyway, and then at least it's on your radar too. So the COVID era has brought with it many lessons. Yep. One thing we've observed is that Zoom meetings are much more efficient than in person from a time perspective. But you sacrifice relationship building and networking. As we move into hybrid meetings, how can we maximize the benefits of virtual, i.e. efficiency, and in-person, i.e. relationship building and networking? Or can't we have it both ways?
Definitely. Very fair. Very fair. I think one of the things, we see some organizations that have committed to, like, they're never going back to in-person board meetings, right? They're staying fully virtual. We have groups that are going hybrid, groups that are desperate to return or already have returned in person. If you're going virtual long-term or staying hybrid long-term for your board meetings, I think still scheduling a separate, once it's safe to, still scheduling a separate in-person social gathering for the board, right? At least twice a year, if not quarterly. That's going to be really critical in making sure those connections are still there, right? We will talk next week about, for virtual board meetings, how to still do a little bit of relationship building. We all know it's not exactly the same, but one pro tip that we'll also talk more about next week is breakout rooms. We've actually seen that work really well for board meetings, that maybe starting in small breakout rooms, because if we all check in and there's 12 of us on the Zoom, it's going to take the whole hour. But if instead we give people 5 minutes, break into small groups of 3, they can actually talk to each other, right? Come back out. It's not the same as connecting with everyone. It's not the same as kind of shaking hands, right? Being in the same room. It gives people some time to have some dialogue and narrative. So there are some tips virtually for how keeping people engaged there.
Yep, that's great. And for those of you interested in that type of, those types of strategies and tips, join us next week on Thursday for that webinar. A couple more here, Matt. We're looking at age diversity for our board. How do we recruit younger, in their 20s most effectively? We thought about a youth advisory board, but would prefer to bring on 2 to 3 actual board members to elevate that perspective from that demographic.
Definitely, yeah. So one of the biggest things there is that job description. Again, the reason we see a lot of folks in their, especially late 20s or 30s, who would be perfect board members for small nonprofits, not join is because in their mind, they're not qualified yet, right? So we need to really set those job descriptions up in ways and make them understand that they are exactly who we're looking for, that they can see themselves in that. In terms of where to go for those folks, most of the time that's going to be a great place to do like business engagement. So working with local companies, tell them, hey, we have some board opportunities. They're always looking for ways to engage, especially that demographic. One of the top reasons those folks stay at their jobs is that they think their companies are civically engaged. So companies have a reason to help you find those people if you're reaching out to them.
Just a reminder to those in the audience, feel free to submit any additional questions you have. We have 2 more that have come in. Sometimes it feels like all of the nonprofits are going after the same board prospects. Can you comment on this? And do you have any thoughts on how best to branch out?
Definitely, yeah. So especially, depending on where you are in a smaller community, right? Or if you have a lot of organizations that have the same type of social issue focus, there probably is that one company, right? Or sometimes that one person that everyone is gunning for there. So I think a lot of times it's thinking again, outside the box a little bit about what are the skills I need? And then who could fill those, right? And who do I actually need versus what I might traditionally think. So again, even that question earlier about younger board members. If I need someone with marketing experience, I don't always need that chief marketer, right? I can sometimes, someone with 10 years of experience is probably fine. 5 years of experience might be fine, depending on how evolved our communications program is. So thinking a little more broadly about who could fit that bill. And then the other thing is a lot of times if we're thinking about, hey, I need a finance person, I'm directly going to all the local accounting firms, remembering that like pretty much every major company has a finance department, right? A good example of this was IBM in DC. a lot of people try to hit them up for tech folks, but they actually have a really great marketing department, right? Really great finance department, really great HR. HR is a really big category for nonprofits to try to get some expertise in. So knowing that any of those bigger companies are going to have other folks that do those things and often don't get asked. So that can be a great kind of hidden spot for folks.
I love the honesty in this question. We're struggling with meeting attendance and quorum. I'd love to have problems with deeper engagement, but at a bare minimum, how do we get people to actually show up?
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about this, about the board meetings also next time, right? Because a little bit of why people show up is what we're going to be doing there when we get there. But again, this is one of those things that the best way to change that culture of engagement is getting new folks that are excited to join. And sometimes this does mean diversifying the skills we're bringing on there. In terms of what I can do with my kind of disengaged current board members, it really is usually boils down to like personal outreach, resetting expectations, having difficult conversations with some of them. This might not be the right time to be on the board, and that's okay. Not seeing that as a failure. Then ultimately kind of shifting our board meetings themselves.
Seeing no other questions, thanks a lot. Matt, do you have anything else you want to add at this point?
No, I think the big thing is really just thinking about casting that wide net. I think the traditional board outreach where we're thinking about just who we already know is great, is a great first step, but also is always going to limit us in terms of kind of how much of the community is going to be aware of us. So thinking about where we can send that out far and wide is a great first thing for our board to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Matt. We appreciate your insights and you sharing your time with us. We also appreciate everyone who attended today. As we mentioned earlier, we'll be sending a follow-up evaluation to you by email along with today's recording. We'll include the slides and also those resources that were mentioned. We do ask you please take a minute to fill out that feedback form and get it back to us so that we have your input about this session. Next week is part 3 of this series. It's on a topic that we've plugged a couple of times today, but we hear it all the time. We hear people talking about this all the time, and that's how to run better board meetings. Matt's going to share some strategies and some different ideas during that webinar. It's taking place on August 19th at 9 a.m. You can register for that at dcmp.org, and I know Mark has dropped that in the chat as well. We hope you'll join us for that next week. Once again, thank you for attending, and we also thank Matt Gayer for sharing his time and expertise with all of us today. Thanks a lot, and take care.